The moment I lifted the pen, a nurse I had never seen before grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Don't sign that." Her grip wasn't aggressive, but it was strong enough to stop my hand in midair. The tip of the pen hovered just above the signature line while the ICU machines continued their steady rhythm around us.
Soft beeps.
Mechanical breathing. The quiet sound of life being measured in numbers and blinking lights. My younger brother Daniel lay in the hospital bed beside me, motionless beneath thin white sheets. A ventilator tube was taped to his mouth, and the rise and fall of his chest looked too perfect, too controlled to belong to a living person anymore. Earlier that morning, the doctors had explained everything in calm, clinical language. Massive cerebral hemorrhage. Severe neurological damage. No meaningful brain function. No chance of recovery. All that remained now was paperwork. Claire, Daniel's wife, had placed the documents neatly on the bedside table herself. Withdrawal of life support authorization. Comfort care transition. Legal confirmation that the hospital could disconnect the machines once the family approved. She stood across the bed watching me closely. Claire had been calm all morning, strangely calm for someone whose husband had been declared brain dead only hours ago. Her arms were folded, posture straight, expression composed but impatient. When the nurse grabbed my wrist, Claire's eyes narrowed immediately. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Her voice sounded controlled, but the irritation underneath it was obvious. The nurse didn't release my hand. "Please," she whispered again, leaning closer so only I could hear. "Just give me 15 minutes before you sign." Only then did I notice her badge catching the fluorescent light. Emily Carter, Neurological Monitoring Unit. Her eyes looked wide, almost frightened, as if she understood something the rest of us didn't. Claire stepped closer to the bed, her heels quiet against the polished floor. "This is a private family matter," she said firmly. "The doctors have already explained the situation." Emily shook her head slightly, but didn't argue. Instead, she looked directly at me, her voice dropping to a level barely above a breath. "Sir, I know this isn't easy, but if you sign that paper now, there's no way to undo it. Just give me 15 minutes to confirm something." Claire let out a slow breath and glanced at the pen still hovering above the page. For a split second, something sharp flashed across her face, something that looked less like grief and more like frustration. "Michael," she said softly, using the same calm tone she had used all morning. "Daniel wouldn't want to live like this. You know that." And she was right. My brother had said those exact words years ago after our father spent weeks on life support. I had repeated them to myself during the entire 7-hour drive from Albuquerque that morning. When Claire called before sunrise, her voice had been steady, almost rehearsed. She told me Daniel collapsed during the night while getting a glass of water. The paramedics arrived quickly, but the damage had already been done. "A hemorrhage," she said. "Sudden. Catastrophic. No warning signs." But there had been something about the call that bothered me even then. Claire hadn't cried. Not once. She spoke in perfect sentences, explaining the situation like someone delivering a report instead of breaking devastating news. She told me which hospital to come to, which floor, which doctor would meet me. She even mentioned the paperwork before I arrived. "They may ask you to help make some decisions," she said calmly. "You're his brother." The moment she said that, something in my stomach tightened. Still, I told myself grief affects people differently. Some people cry. Others become quiet and controlled. By the time I arrived at the hospital hours later, the neurologist had already delivered the same explanation Claire gave me on the phone. Daniel's brain showed almost no activity. The damage was too severe. Recovery was impossible. The machines were the only thing keeping his body alive. Now I stood beside his bed with a pen in my hand and a stranger whispering for me to stop. The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier. The air smelled like antiseptic and recycled oxygen. Claire cleared her throat impatiently. "Michael," she said again, "we shouldn't delay this any longer." Emily's grip tightened just slightly around my wrist. 15 minutes, she repeated quietly. "That's all I'm asking." I looked from her frightened eyes to the documents on the table, then across the bed to Claire's calm, watchful face. Something deep in my chest shifted at that moment. An old instinct I had learned to trust during 20 years working as a financial investigator. Numbers told stories people tried to hide. Patterns exposed lies that looked perfectly normal on the surface. And suddenly, standing in that ICU room, one thought kept echoing in my head. If my brother was truly gone, why did everyone seem so desperate for me to sign quickly? Slowly, I lowered the pen and set it back on the table. Claire stared at me, disbelief flashing across her face. "What are you doing?" she asked. My heart was pounding, but my voice surprised me with how calm it sounded. "I'm taking 15 minutes. Emily finally released my wrist, exhaling quietly as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. I didn't know it yet, but those 15 minutes were about to uncover a truth none of us were prepared for, and a plan someone had been very careful to hide. Emily didn't take me to an office or a waiting room. Instead, she led me through a narrow service hallway behind the ICU nurse's station, past a locked supply cabinet, and into a small monitoring room filled with glowing screens. The lights were dim, and the quiet hum of machines filled the air. Several monitors displayed lines moving steadily across black backgrounds, heart rhythms, oxygen levels, neurological signals. Emily closed the door behind us and finally let go of my wrist. Only then did I notice her hands were trembling. She took a deep breath before speaking, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her head many times and still wasn't sure how to begin. "I'm not supposed to interfere with family decisions," she said quietly, "but something about your brother's case doesn't make sense." I sat down slowly in the chair beside the main monitor. My heart was still racing from the tension in the ICU room. "What exactly doesn't make sense?" I asked. Emily turned one of the screens toward me. A thin green line moved across it, rising and falling in small, irregular waves. I wasn't a neurologist, but I had seen enough hospital monitors in my life to recognize one thing immediately. The line wasn't flat. "They told you he has no meaningful brain activity, right?" she asked. I nodded. Emily pointed at the screen. "That's not what this shows." For a moment, I didn't understand what she meant. I stared at the pattern moving across the monitor, trying to process the words. "You're saying he still has brain function?" "I'm saying there are responses," she replied carefully. "Small ones, inconsistent ones, but they're there. When sedation is reduced even slightly, his neurological signals change. His heart rate increases. Facial muscles react. Those things shouldn't happen if the brain is completely gone." The room suddenly felt colder. "But the neurologist said." "The neurologist saw the chart," Emily interrupted gently. "And the chart isn't accurate." She walked to another screen and pulled up a digital log filled with timestamps and medication names. Several entries were highlighted in red. "These are the sedatives your brother has been receiving," she explained. "Heavy doses. Strong enough to suppress neurological response almost completely." I leaned forward. "Are those normal?" "They can be," Emily said, "for certain conditions. But the pattern here isn't normal." She tapped one of the timestamps. "Every time your sister-in-law visits alone, the sedative level increases within the hour." My stomach tightened. That could just be coincidence. Emily nodded slowly. "That's what I told myself at first." She opened a folder on her tablet and showed me a series of photos she had taken of the medication pumps attached to Daniel's foreline. Each photo showed the settings and concentration labels on the bags. 2 nights ago, I came in early from my shift, she said. Around 1:20 in the morning. Your brother's room door was closed, which isn't allowed unless procedures are being done. When I went inside, your sister-in-law was standing near the pump. My chest tightened. She said the doctor had adjusted the sedation levels. Emily paused before continuing, but the dosage didn't match the doctor's orders. She showed me another image. The label on the medication bag had clearly been replaced. When I asked about it, she told me not to worry about it. Said the physician had already approved everything. Did you check with the doctor? I tried. Emily looked down at the tablet. But by the time I checked the digital chart later that morning, the dosage entries had been changed. Silence filled the room. Someone had altered the records. And that's not the only thing, Emily said quietly. She pulled up another graph, this one showing neurological spikes. These are your brother's brain signals during short periods when the sedatives drop slightly. See these reactions here? The spikes were small, but they were unmistakable. That's not brain death, she said. The words hit me like a shock. Outside the monitoring room, I could hear faint footsteps and voices in the hallway. Somewhere a machine alarm chirped briefly before being silenced. If this is true, I said slowly, why hasn't anyone else noticed? Emily hesitated. Because the official neurologist evaluation only lasted 10 minutes. 10 minutes. She nodded. And it happened right after the highest sedation dose of the day. The implication hung in the air. Someone had made sure Daniel looked worse during the test. I leaned back in the chair, trying to process everything. But Claire can't just order medication changes, I said. She's not a doctor. No, Emily agreed. She can't. Then who did? Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled up one last document. It was a digital authorization log. Several entries had been added and deleted over the past 3 days. One name kept appearing in the approval field. Dr. Leonard Hayes. That's the attending neurologist who signed the brain death assessment, Emily said quietly. My pulse started racing again. You think he's involved? I think someone with medical authority approved these changes, she replied. She zoomed in on the screen. And I think someone else made sure the records looked clean afterward. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My thoughts raced back through the last 2 days. The constant pressure to sign the forms, Claire's calm insistence that Daniel would never want to live like this, the urgency in her voice every time the paperwork was mentioned. Something about it had always felt rushed. Now I understood why. Emily turned the monitor back toward her. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. What? Your brother's reflex responses have been getting stronger. You mean he could wake up? I don't know, she admitted. But I know one thing for certain. She pointed toward the ICU hallway. If life support is withdrawn now, we'll never find out. My chest tightened. That was exactly what Claire wanted me to authorize. Why tell me? I asked. Emily looked at me with tired eyes. Because once those papers are signed, everything happening here becomes legal. The words echoed in my head. Legal. Not right. Just legal. If I'm wrong, she continued, you can sign the documents in 15 minutes and nothing changes. But if I'm right and you sign now, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I stood up slowly, staring at the neurological spikes still moving across the monitor. My brother's brain was still fighting, and someone wanted the machines turned off before anyone realized it. How long until the next neurological evaluation? I asked. Emily checked the clock. About 40 minutes. That wasn't enough time to gather evidence, but it might be enough time to stop the plan. I took a deep breath. Okay, I said. Emily looked up. Okay, what? Okay, we're not signing anything. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. What are you going to do? I looked toward the ICU hallway, where Claire was still waiting beside Daniel's bed, believing the hardest part was already over. I'm going back in there, I said. And I'm going to make her think she's about to win. Emily frowned. What does that mean? It means, I said slowly, while she's watching the pen, you're going to buy time. I nodded, because if someone had gone this far to hide the truth, the most dangerous moment wasn't discovering the lie. The most dangerous moment was letting them know we knew. I walked back toward the ICU doors with the documents still in my hand, my heart pounding harder with every step. Claire looked up immediately when I entered the room. Her eyes went straight to the papers. Well, she asked. I forced a tired smile. I think I'm ready. For the first time that day, she looked relieved. She didn't realize those 15 minutes had already changed everything. And she definitely didn't realize the next 15 minutes might destroy the plan she thought was perfect. When I walked back into Daniel's ICU room, Claire was standing exactly where I had left her, near the foot of the bed. The documents were still spread neatly across the small table beside the chair, the pen resting carefully on top like the final piece of a quiet ritual. For a moment she studied my face, searching for hesitation, doubt, or resistance. I made sure she saw none of it. I lowered myself slowly into the chair beside Daniel's bed and picked up the pen again, letting my shoulders slump slightly as if exhaustion had finally defeated whatever uncertainty I had before. Claire's posture relaxed almost immediately. It was subtle, but I noticed it. The tightness in her jaw faded. Her arms unfolded. She stepped a little closer to the table, her eyes fixed on the papers. I know this is hard, she said softly, but it's the right thing to do. I nodded slowly, staring down at the forms while pretending to read them carefully. In reality, I was buying time. Somewhere down the hallway, Emily was contacting the hospital's chief neurologist and preparing to show him the monitoring data she had been collecting. If everything went right, someone with real authority would step into this room before the machines were turned off. But if anything went wrong, if the wrong person intercepted that information or warned Claire before the evidence was reviewed, then everything could collapse in seconds. Claire moved closer to Daniel's bedside and gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. The gesture looked tender, almost loving. If I hadn't seen the neurological readings 15 minutes earlier, I might have believed it completely. He wouldn't want to live like this, she said quietly. Her voice sounded rehearsed. Not emotional. Not broken. Just calm. I lowered the pen again, as if something had occurred to me. There's one thing I still don't understand, I said. Claire's eyes flicked toward me immediately. What? The doctor said the damage happened suddenly. I continued. But Daniel had a full physical 3 months ago. Everything came back normal. That's how hemorrhages work, she replied quickly. They can happen without warning. Right, I said slowly. But what about the medication he was taking? She blinked. What medication? The new prescription, I said. The one he mentioned on the phone a few weeks ago. For the first time since I walked back into the room, Claire hesitated. I don't know what you're talking about. That told me more than any answer could have. Daniel had told me about that prescription during one of our weekly calls. It was just a mild blood pressure medication his doctor recommended after noticing a slightly elevated reading during a routine visit. Nothing serious. But Claire should have known about it. Unless Daniel never told her. Or unless she was pretending not to know. I tapped the papers lightly with a pen. It's strange, I said casually, because medications can interact with other substances in dangerous ways. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. What exactly are you implying? Nothing, I replied calmly. Just trying to understand everything before I sign. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The ventilator continued its slow mechanical rhythm beside Daniel's bed. Claire glanced at the hallway, then back at the papers. "We've already gone over all of this," she said more firmly. "The doctors explained everything." "I know." I looked down at Daniel's face. His skin was warm, not pale or waxy the way I remembered our father looking during his final days on life support. His brow twitched faintly for just a fraction of a second. It was so small I almost missed it. But Claire didn't. Her eyes widened before she quickly looked away. "Reflex," she said quickly. "The doctor said that can happen." I didn't respond. Instead, I leaned closer to Daniel, placing my hand lightly over his. His fingers felt warm, alive. I had to force myself not to react. Behind me, footsteps suddenly echoed in the hallway outside the ICU room. Claire glanced toward the door again, this time with visible tension. "Michael," she said quietly, "you're dragging this out." I turned back toward the table. "You're right," I said. Then I lifted the pen again. Claire exhaled slowly, relief spreading across her face. Her shoulders dropped, as if the weight she'd been carrying for days was finally about to disappear. But just as the pen touched the paper, the ICU door swung open. 3 people stepped inside. A tall, gray-haired man in a white coat entered first, his expression sharp and focused. Behind him stood Emily, holding a tablet, and a hospital administrator whose badge identified him as Director of Clinical Oversight. Claire's entire body stiffened. "What is this?" she demanded. The gray-haired doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked straight to the monitors beside Daniel's bed and began reviewing the readings. Then he turned toward Claire. "I'm Dr. Robert Callahan," he said calmly, "Chief of Neurology." Claire's confidence faltered. And your husband is not brain dead." The words seemed to freeze the air in the room. Claire stared at him. "That's impossible." Dr. Callahan held up the tablet Emily handed him. The screen displayed the neurological graphs I had seen earlier. "These readings show preserved neurological activity," he said. "Activity that was suppressed by unusually high sedation levels." Claire's eyes darted toward the 4-pump beside the bed. "That medication was prescribed by the attending physician," she said quickly. Dr. Callahan nodded slowly. "Yes." Then he turned to the administrator. "And those prescriptions were altered in the hospital record system 3 separate times." The administrator stepped forward. "We've already reviewed the security footage from the ICU corridor." Claire's face went pale. "What footage?" The administrator turned the tablet toward me first. The video showed Daniel's hospital room from the hallway camera angle. Claire was clearly visible entering the room late at night with a nurse's access badge. Minutes later, she stood beside the 4-pump adjusting its settings. Another clip followed. This one showed Dr. Leonard Hayes, the neurologist who declared Daniel brain dead, entering the room shortly after. Claire's voice shook. "This doesn't prove anything." Dr. Callahan's expression hardened. "It proves someone deliberately increased the sedation levels before neurological evaluations." The administrator folded his arms. "And it proves the hospital system was accessed using a physician's credentials to modify medical records." Claire backed away from the bed. "You can't accuse me of something like this." At that exact moment, 2 hospital security officers appeared in the doorway. One of them spoke calmly. "Mrs. Walker, we need you to step away from the patient." Her eyes darted toward the papers on the table. The unsigned papers. Realization flooded her face. "You called them," she whispered. I didn't answer. Because at that moment, Daniel's fingers moved again. Not a reflex, not a twitch. A slow, deliberate squeeze around my hand. Dr. Callahan noticed it immediately. "Reduce sedation now," he ordered. Emily moved quickly to the 4-pump. Claire stared at Daniel's hand gripping mine, her face drained of all color. That's not possible, she murmured. Dr. Callahan looked directly at her. It is when someone isn't dying. Outside the ICU room, distant police sirens began echoing through the hospital entrance. Claire slowly turned toward the door, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked terrified. The police officers entered the ICU room, and the atmosphere changed immediately. The quiet sounds of the machines continued, but everyone in the room understood that the situation had shifted. Claire stood near the foot of Daniel's bed, her hands slowly tightening at her sides. The documents were still on the table beside me and signed. One of the officers looked around the room and then spoke in a calm voice. "Claire Walker, please step away from the patient." Claire shook her head. "This is unnecessary. I'm his wife." Dr. Callahan answered before anyone else could speak. "Right now we need to review several medical irregularities. Until that review is complete, you are not authorized to be near the patient without supervision." Claire's composure started to slip. "Irregularities? What are you talking about?" The hospital administrator stepped forward with a tablet that contained the monitoring data and security footage. The sedation levels administered to Daniel Walker were increased multiple times without proper medical authorization. The hospital records were also altered after those changes were made. Claire looked from the administrator to the police officers. "You're accusing me of something based on numbers on a screen?" The officer answered calmly. "We're asking questions. That's why we need you to come with us." Claire glanced toward the hallway as if searching for a way out, but two security officers were already standing there. For a moment she remained silent. Then she looked toward Daniel. His eyes were still closed, but his fingers were wrapped weakly around mine. The sedation was already being lowered, and the monitors beside the bed were showing stronger neurological activity. "That shouldn't be happening," Claire muttered quietly. Dr. Callahan looked at the monitors and nodded to Emily. "Continue reducing sedation. Slowly." Emily adjusted the four-pump while keeping her attention on the screens. One of the police officers spoke again. "Mrs. Walker, please step outside so we can talk." Claire didn't move. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "The doctor approved everything." Dr. Callahan turned toward the administrator. "Where is Dr. Hayes?" The administrator answered immediately. "Security has already located him. He's being questioned by hospital investigators." Claire's eyes widened. "You can't do this," she said. The officer stepped closer. "We can, and we are." After a few seconds of silence, Claire finally walked toward the door. Her steps were slow and uncertain. The officers followed her out into the hallway. The moment the door closed behind them, the tension inside the room shifted. The focus returned to Daniel. Dr. Callahan studied the monitors for several seconds. "Neurological response is improving," he said. "That's a good sign." I remained beside the bed, still holding Daniel's hand. "Will he wake up?" I asked. The doctor answered honestly. "We don't know yet, but the readings show that his brain is active. That changes everything." Emily looked relieved but stayed focused on the equipment. "If the sedation continues to decrease safely," she said, "he may start responding more." Minutes passed slowly. Nurses moved quietly around the room while adjusting equipment and updating the treatment plan. The ventilator continued assisting Daniel's breathing, but the settings were being reduced step by step. About 20 minutes later, Daniel's eyelids moved. Emily noticed it first. There was a response. Dr. Callahan stepped closer to the bed. "Daniel, can you hear me?" he asked. Daniel didn't open his eyes yet, but his fingers tightened again around mine. "He's responding to stimuli," the doctor said. My chest felt tight as I watched him. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, hope replaced the heavy feeling that had followed me through the ICU halls. Outside the room, voices could be heard in the hallway as investigators and officers continued their work. Hospital administration had already begun reviewing every medication entry connected to Daniel's chart. About an hour later, the administrator returned. "Police have taken Mrs. Walker to the station for questioning," he said. "Dr. Hayes has also been detained while investigators review financial records connected to him." "Financial records?" I asked. The administrator nodded. "There appears to have been a transfer of funds from a private account connected to Mrs. Walker." Dr. Callahan shook his head slowly. "That explains the altered orders." The administrator continued. "There's also a life insurance policy involved. The beneficiary is Mrs. Walker." The pieces were becoming clear. Emily stood quietly near the monitors. She had been the first person to question what was happening. "If the sedation had continued," she said softly, "the neurological tests would have looked worse every day." Dr. Callahan nodded. "And eventually someone would have authorized withdrawal of life support." Everyone in the room understood what that meant. I looked at Daniel again. The machines were still helping him breathe, but his body was beginning to take over more of the work. 2 hours later, Daniel's eyes finally opened. At first his gaze was unfocused. He blinked several times, trying to understand where he was. "Daniel?" I said. His eyes slowly turned toward me.
His voice was weak.
"Michael." Relief spread through the room. "You're in the hospital," I said. "You're safe." Dr. Callahan spoke gently. "Daniel, you experienced a brain hemorrhage, but you're stable now. We're going to help you recover." Daniel looked confused, but aware. Over the next few hours, the medical team continued monitoring his progress. The ventilator was removed later that evening when doctors confirmed he could breathe on his own. The following days were filled with rehabilitation evaluations and neurological testing. Daniel had weakness on the left side of his body and would need therapy to regain full strength, but the doctors were confident he would recover with time. Meanwhile, the investigation moved quickly. Police uncovered messages between Claire and Dr. Hayes discussing sedation levels and hospital procedures. Financial transfers confirmed that large payments had been made to Hayes in the months before Daniel's hospitalization. Claire had also taken out a large life insurance policy on Daniel less than a year earlier. Both Claire and Dr. Hayes were formally charged with multiple crimes including medical fraud and attempted homicide. Weeks later, Daniel was transferred to a rehabilitation center. The first day he was able to walk down the hallway with assistance, he stopped near the window and looked outside for a long moment. "I almost didn't make it," he said quietly. I nodded. "But you did."
He looked at me.
"What happened?" I told him the truth. About the paperwork. About Emily stopping my hand before I signed. About the investigation that followed. Daniel listened silently. Finally, he said one sentence. "I trusted her." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "That wasn't your mistake." Months later, Daniel returned home to continue his recovery. His strength improved every week. Therapy helped him regain balance and coordination. Some memories from the night of the hemorrhage were still missing, but doctors said that was normal. One evening we sat outside watching the sunset. Daniel took a deep breath and said quietly, "I'm still here." And that was the only thing that truly mattered. Sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival is a single moment when someone chooses to question what everyone else accepts. In our case, that moment happened when a nurse decided to speak up, and when a signature never touched the paper.